Hey fisher friends, welcome to Getting It Done on Chicken Thigh Fishing. Today we're going to break down and clean a Soleus reel from Favorite Fishing. Stick around. Hey guys, Keith here. Thanks for jumping aboard again today. We're going to continue our reel cleaning series, and today we're going to break down a Soleus reel from Favorite Fishing, one of my favorite reels, and we're going to completely disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble. So let's get to it. As always, my first couple of tips for reel cleaning is make sure you have a schematic on hand. And that usually comes in a manual in a box with your reel. If you don't have one, go ahead to the website of the manufacturer of your reel and you should be able to download and print one. It's always a good idea to have that handy in case you need to refer to it for any reason. Second thing is, always work on a movable surface. Especially when you're new at breaking down bait casting reels, this is something that could take you an hour or more to do. And if you're somebody that could get pulled away from doing this job, you don't want to have all these components of this reel on a dining room table, for example, and then have to leave and worry about a pet or a child or anything getting into your parts and messing them up on you, or worse yet, losing one of them. So I always recommend working on a movable work surface, and I use a cookie sheet here. So if I have to leave in the middle of breaking down a reel, I can just take this, put it on top of the fridge, put it on top of a cabinet, whatever I need to do, and get it out of harm's way. And then whenever I come back to it, I can just grab my disassembled reel and continue my work. So just a couple of tips for you there. So let's get right to it. Our first step in breaking down our reel, as always, is to remove the palm side plate. And on a Soleus reel, it has a rocker switch on the front bottom of the palm side plate. You rock that switch, rotate the palm side plate, and you are able to remove the palm side plate and the spool. I'm going to place those aside. With those two components removed, we can move over to the handle side of the reel, where we will remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. So first things first, most bait casting reels these days have a handle nut retainer, which is held in place by a handle nut retainer screw. So you have to remove that screw. Once you remove that screw, typically gravity will work to remove the handle nut retainer. If that doesn't pop off for you, nice and easy like that, if it's stuck to the handle with dirt or grime or oil or anything, just take a small screwdriver, small slotted screwdriver, and you can pop it off really easily. So next is the handle nut, and I always am careful to advise people, especially if you haven't done this before, when you remove the handle on a left-handed reel, if you're a lefty like me, if the handle is on the left-hand side of the reel, it's not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey like everything else, it's reverse. So you don't want to turn it the wrong way because you can strip that nut very easily. So we're going to use a 10mm wrench, and we are going to turn it to the right to loosen it. All you got to do is crack it, and then you can do the rest of it by hand. And then you can remove the handle. Now, a lot of times the handle washer that goes underneath here is going to be stuck to your handle, so you want to be wary of that. In this case, it stayed on the main gear shaft, but if you look here and there's not a washer, if you look on the back of your handle, it'll be stuck to the handle. So you would just take that off. But in this case, it stayed on the gear shaft, so we're just going to take off the handle nut washer. So now that you have the handle assembly removed, you can go ahead and remove the star drag, which is as simple as unscrewing it. Once you get past the click washer, it should just spin right off for you. Now, underneath the star drag on a bait casting reel, you're always going to have a series of washers. On some reels, like this reel, you're also going to have a click washer. Now, the click washer holds the other washers, so you want to take this out as kind of a sandwich. You want to sandwich those together so you don't mess up the order or the orientation that they're in. And I'll show you what that looks like. So inside here, you will have a washer. And then you will have two curved washers. And you want to take those out of this click washer and keep them in the same orientation, because these two washers have a curve to them. And you want to keep the curve going in the same direction when you reassemble them. So when you take them out and when you pick them up to clean them, and then when you reassemble, you want to keep them in the same orientation that you removed them. And this is your click washer and click spring. So now that we have those off, the next component is the sleeve that goes over the main gear shaft. Now, sometimes you can get that out at this point, sometimes you can't. So I'm going to tap it, see if I can let gravity work and pull it out. And so yes, it's coming out here. Now sometimes you will have yet another washer or even two on top of this sleeve. But this reel doesn't have any extra washers on top of the sleeve. So you can remove the sleeve right off the main gear shaft. Now, an important thing to note about this sleeve is that at first glance the ends appear to be identical. They appear to have circular ends. But there's a slight difference. On one of the ends, it has two straight sides. It's really kind of hard to see sometimes, but it's kind of in the shape of this here. It's like an oblong rectangle. And so that side always goes up and out of the reel. So facing the top of the gear shaft. So you want to be cognizant of that when you remove it. So when you pick it up and you clean it, and then when it comes time for reassembly, you put it back on the same way so you don't have to then dismantle your reel again to flip it back over. Now, if that doesn't come out when you tip it upside down and lightly tap it, that's not a big deal, because you can easily take it out once you remove the handle side plate, which is going to be our next step anyway. So if you can't get that out right away and by tipping it upside down and by lightly tapping it, it's not a big deal. As soon as you take off the handle side plate, you'll be able to pop that out and you'll be able to clean it. So our next order of business is to remove the actual handle side plate. Now, the palm side plate was held on, you recall, with that rocker switch that released it. Handle side plates are held on by screws, usually a set of screws on the outside and one or more screws on the inside. So we'll take a look at this reel, and we have two screws on the outside, and we have two screws that I can see on the back side. So we'll start by removing these screws. So I have the two screws removed from the front side. Now we're going to go to the back side, and I have a screw here, and I have a screw here. And when you remove the screws from the outside and the inside of the handle side plate, you want to put them in the order, in the same pattern that you take them out, so you put them back in the same hole when it comes time to reassembly, because reels have different sizes, screws, different lengths and different diameters of screws, and so you don't waste your time trying to put the wrong screw in the wrong hole when it comes time for reassembly. Don't mix them all up. Lay them out in a manner in which you know which holes they go back into. So now I'm able to remove the handle side plate, and what I will do is I'll lay it down here and I'll put the screws in a pattern where they go. So I know that that screw goes in that hole, that screw goes in this hole. I know that this screw goes in the back and this screw goes in the other side on the back. And so now we are ready to take a look inside. And here's where I recommend folks take a photograph, especially if you haven't done this very often or if it's your first time doing it. It's a good idea to take a nice photo here so you see the orientation of everything and where everything goes. So if you have to refer to it or you forget something or something doesn't look right to you when you are reassembling, you can take a look at your photograph and maybe figure out what you might have put back in the wrong position. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the yoke and the pinion gear, and that has two springs on it that you will see here. And you remove the springs from the yoke post, and then by grabbing the pinion gear you can lift the yoke out off the two yoke posts. And one other thing I recommend for some reels is once you have the side plates off, this can tip over easily and then you might have a part come off and you're not sure where it goes back. So I would prop it up on something. A lot of times I use a screwdriver or some reel grease or a reel oil container, and that way it won't tip over. So here I have the yoke and the pinion gear. And the pinion gear has a fat side and a skinny side. That fat side always goes down and the skinny side always goes up. And the middle of it, where you see that groove, is where it seats into the yoke. So we're going to put that yoke in the pinion gear. And now we're able to remove the main gear and drag washer assembly. So I'm going to carefully lift that up. Sometimes that'll give you a little hard time depending on if your reel's ever been cleaned before, how dirty it is, how much gunk is in there. And so you may have to tug on it a little bit to free it up, but you want to make sure you do that under control and don't use too much force in doing so. And when you lift that off, underneath the main gear, you're going to want to make sure again that you kind of sandwich this, because there's going to be multiple washers here on top of each other. But also underneath, you're going to have some components stick to the bottom of this gear. And so you'll see me pull out the ratchet and a carbon fiber washer. And they stuck to the bottom of the gear because of the oil and the dirt that's in here. Now sometimes you will pull the main gear off and they won't stick to it, and you'll see them here at the bottom, at the base of the main gear shaft. But more often than not, when you take that main gear off, those two components are going to be underneath, so you want to know that those are there. So I'm going to lay the rest of the drag washer assembly out in order, and I'm going to make sure there's nothing stuck to each component. And it's going to consist of metal washers and carbon fiber washers. And this one has yet another carbon fiber washer. And so what I'm going to do is lay those all out in the order that I'm going to put them back in. So it's kind of important to pay attention to the order you take them off in. So there is your drag washer and main gear assembly. Now the next thing we're going to remove is the main gear shaft. that has a lower gear attached to it, which meshes with the worm gear. And that is usually held in by 2 screws on a bearing plate, and underneath we will find a bearing that we want to clean and oil. So I'm going to remove those 2 screws. Once I remove those 2 screws, there's one of them, there's the other, I can remove the main gear shaft, which has a bearing underneath it. Now sometimes that bearing won't be attached to the bearing plate like this. This one is attached to the bearing plate with an E-clip. Sometimes it just lays free in this bearing pocket here. So on this particular reel, the bearing is attached and we don't really need to take it off to clean it. We can sufficiently clean it and oil it without bothering to take it apart. So we're going to put that main gear shaft aside and the 2 screws that go to that. So the next part that we are going to take care of is the level wind guide and worm gear assembly. So that consists of multiple parts in here, and you're going to want to take pictures here again if you haven't done this before, so you know what the palm side looks like with this E-clip, and so you know what the handle side looks like with this gear and this E-clip here. So the first thing we're going to do to access this is we're going to remove this decorative hood, this plastic shroud here. Those are typically held on by 1 screw on each side. And we're going to put those over here. And then we should be able to simply wiggle that hood off. And that's kind of thin plastic. So when it comes to handling it and cleaning it, you don't want to manhandle it because you could probably break those ears off pretty easily. So I'm going to place that hood along with the screws right over here. So the next thing we're going to remove is this rod in here. There's a metal rod and it's called a pillar or a level wind rod. And what that does is it goes through the level wind guide and you just work that out and it's going to come out the handle side. And it only goes in one way. It only goes in this way and out this way. So you want to keep it oriented in the same manner for reassembly, because you're not going to want to try to put it in this side because it's not going to fit. One end of it has a little nub that fits into the corresponding hole on the other side, and the other end does not. So it only goes in this way. So while I'm looking at the face of the reel, I'm going to lay it down in the same orientation that I take it out, so I know when I'm looking at this, when I'm reassembling, I put it back in the same way. And now that I have that pillar out, that frees up, that starts to free up the level wind guide, but not completely, because the level wind guide is engaged with the worm gear. The way you disengage that is by removing this nut here, which you can usually do by hand, but if it's too tight, it has a slot for a slotted screwdriver, and you can just stick a screwdriver in there, but most of the time you can just pop this out by hand. Now when I remove the cap, there's going to be a spacer, and usually that spacer, it's a very tiny component. It either sticks to the top of the pawl that goes in this hole, or it sticks in the cap, and in this case it is inside the cap. So I'm not even going to bother taking it out. I'm just going to leave the cap there. And now I'm going to remove the pawl from inside here, and usually gravity will do that for you. Just give it a tap, and there you have the pawl. It's this metal piece with these 2 ears, and those ears engage with the worm gear. So I have the cap and the spacer inside it and the pawl, and now the level wind guide is no longer engaged to the worm gear. So we can start to remove the worm gear. Now on this reel, it has an E-clip on both sides. You want to make sure you lay this out the same way you take it off so it doesn't become complicated in putting it back together. Now those E-clips are small, and the way I typically remove them is by using a very small slotted screwdriver. And I get the tip of the screwdriver in there. There's usually little notches you can get in and pop it off, but you want to be sure when you do that to cover it with your palm and cover the whole reel with your hand, because when you pop that off, if you don't have it covered, that could go flying. And believe me when I tell you, if this goes flying across a room, especially in a carpet, good luck finding it. So I'm going to start on the palm side where it has the bigger E-clip, and I'm going to put the tip of my screwdriver in there. I'm going to cover it with my hand, and I'm going to pop that E-clip off. And there she is. And now underneath that E-clip is going to be a spacer. And then there's a little plastic bushing. And that frees up this side. So now I'm going to turn over to the handle side. And now I'm able to pull out the worm gear, leaving me with the worm gear tube and the level wind guide. But I'm going to hold that there for a minute because I want to get back to that with you. Now on the worm gear, when it comes out, you want to make sure that you are cognizant of the side that it goes in. For example, this side has a gear on it and it has a bearing behind it, and you know that that gear goes on the handle side because this is where the main gear shaft and the main gear goes, and that's what meshes with this gear. So looking at the front of it, I'm going to leave it like this because I know that's the direction that it's going to go back in. And so now I'm going to take out the worm gear tube, and as I do, I'm going to slide the level wind guide off of it. Now here is your level wind guide, and the big hole is for the worm gear tube, and the smaller hole is for that pillar rod that we took out. And then the hole on this side is where that pawl goes in. And so now regarding the worm gear tube, it only goes back in one way, and one end of it on the gear side, on the handle side of the housing, has a lipped edge. So when you go to put this back on, you don't want to try to put it back on the opposite way, because that lipped edge is a cup that actually holds the bearing in place underneath that gear. So I'm going to keep that in the same orientation that I removed it. And you can see all the debris that has fallen out of this reel in the worm gear. So that was a dirty worm gear. That's quite a bit of grass and debris. And so that is as far as we're going to break this reel down. Now you can break the reel down further if you like. There are multiple other components in the thumb release, and there's springs and screws and things in here. There's really no need to go any further than this for routine maintenance and cleaning. Okay, so now that we're disassembled, we're going to go ahead and clean everything. Now there's no one right way to clean reel parts. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of different methods they use. I typically use Lysol or Clorox cleaning wipes. They've always worked well for me. If you have a better way to do it or a way that you prefer, by all means leave a comment, because I'm always open to suggestions. So now I'm just going to go ahead and clean each part of the reel. Okay, so we're done cleaning all the different components that we disassembled, and it wasn't a super dirty reel. I had cleaned this not too long ago, so we got a little dirt out of there, but nothing too crazy. So we're ready for reassembly. So for the reassembly, we're basically going to go in reverse order from the disassembly for the most part. So we're going to start with the worm gear and the worm gear tube and the level wind guide. So when I do this, I'm going to hold the housing facing me, because that's the way I remember the orientation of the components when I remove them. So we're going to start off with the worm gear tube, which is going to be inserted from the handle side of the reel. And once I have that halfway through, I am going to go ahead and put on the level wind guide. You recall it's got the one big hole for the worm gear tube and then the smaller hole for the level wind pin or pillar. And once we get that on there, we can go ahead and seat the opposite side of the worm gear tube in the corresponding hole on the palm side of the reel. And you just have to manipulate that a little bit and you'll hear it and feel it click into place. And so once you have that worm gear tube inserted through the level wind guide, we can go ahead and insert the worm gear itself. Now that worm gear, if you recall, only goes in one way, and the gear side goes on the handle side, so we know that's the way it's going to go in. Now I did not remove this E-clip and remove that gear because there was no need to do that. I was able to sufficiently clean it like that. So now on the opposite end, on the palm side of the worm gear, we're going to go ahead and replace the bushing and the spacer and the E-clip that we removed from that side. And when you have it in enough, there should be enough of the tip of the worm gear protruding out from the top to be able to put the spacer on and then the E-clip. And once I have that spacer on, now you'll see that I'm holding it from the bottom to make sure that I have the worm gear protruding up the top as far as I can, because you want to have enough clearance to be able to fasten the E-clip on. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to put the E-clip in place. And once I get it into position where I can pop it on, I'll put the screwdriver in place, put some pressure on it, and then I'll cup my hand over it so the E-clip doesn't go flying. So there we go. So you have the E-clip on that side fastened, and you have the gear on this side, and we are good to go to move to the next step. So now what we are going to do next to make sure that the level wind guide is in the proper position is we're going to reinsert the pillar. So we're going to take that pillar and we're going to go through the handle side of the reel. We're going to go through the smaller hole on the level wind guide, and then the nub on the end of that pillar is going to seat into the corresponding hole on the palm side of the reel housing. And you just have to kind of get it so it seats in there, and you'll usually know it's seated in there when it's flush on the side that you put it in. So once I do that, I don't want to tip it over, because if I tip it over, it may fall out because it's only laying in there. What keeps that pillar secured is the hood, but we can't put the hood on until we put the pawl and the cap back on the level wind guide, because if you put the hood on first, you're not going to be able to get at that level wind guide. So we're going to go ahead and take the pawl, and the pawl has two ears on it, and those ears go down and they mesh with the worm gear. And so you drop that in, and if it sticks above the opening, it's not seated properly, and all you have to do is turn the worm gear, and what that'll do is that'll allow that pawl to fall into place, and it will be flush or just below flush with the edge of the hole that you put it in. So once you put that in there, you can replace the cap and hand tighten it, and so now you know that the level wind guide is in the correct position because both the pillar and the pawl are in place and they have the worm gear engaged. So you don't need to go crazy tightening that. You can usually just hand tighten it and you're all set. So I'm still putting pressure on this side so that pillar doesn't fall out, and I'm going to replace the hood. Once I have that hood in place, the ear on the side of the hood is going to keep the pillar in place and it won't fall out when I tip it over. So there we have the hood. And so now I can move the housing and I don't have to worry about any of those components falling out. And then we're going to just replace the small screws that secure the hood to the body of the reel. You don't want to go too crazy tightening those down because that hood is made out of thin plastic, and if you over tighten you could certainly crack or break the ears on that hood. Okay, so the first step of our reassembly is complete. We have the level wind guide and the worm gear assembly and the hood back on. So now we are going to move to the handle side of the reel, and here I usually take something to prop my reel up so it doesn't fall over. So now that we're ready for that, the first thing that we're going to install is the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. Before I install that, I'm going to hit that bearing with a drop of reel oil. I'm going to reinstall that and line up the holes. It has 2 screws, if you remember. I'm going to take those screws and hold this in place. Okay, so we have the main gear shaft reinstalled, and we're going to move over to the pinion gear and the yoke. So the pinion gear has the fat part on one end and the skinnier part, and the fat part goes down and into your reel. And the groove in the middle is what goes into the yoke. And then you simply drop the pinion gear into the gear hole and the yoke onto the yoke posts. And you will know you have that in correctly if there's enough posts sticking up to be able to put the yoke post screws on, springs rather. And in the event that you flip that yoke over during the cleaning and you put it on, you know you have it on upside down. If it doesn't seat down properly enough, those posts won't stick up in order for you to put these springs back on, so you'll know it's upside down. All you have to do is flip it over. So now we have the main gear shaft and the pinion gear and yoke in place. So we will go ahead and reinstall the main gear and washer assembly. First goes the ratchet, and the ratchet has that oblong rectangular opening, and that fits on the base of the gear shaft. And so you want to make sure that gets seated properly on that base. Your carbon fiber washer, your main gear. Now when you put the main gear down, it should mesh perfectly with the pinion gear. They work in concert together. So now we're going to reinstall our washer assembly in the same order that we removed them, in reverse order. And typically it goes from carbon washer to metal to carbon to metal. This washer has 2 ears on it that fit inside these notches on the main gear. And then the final drag washer. And so now we have that assembled. And at this point we're ready to replace the handle side plate, but before we do that we're going to go ahead and grease the gears. And I'm going to take my reel grease here, and I'm not going to put a ton on here, but I'm just going to put a little bit of grease coating on the outside of the main gear, on the outside gear edge, and then when that interacts with the pinion gear, that will distribute the grease, and so the gears will be sufficiently lubricated. Okay, so now we are ready for the handle side plate. Now on the handle side plate, there's going to be a bearing in there for the spool tensioner. So before I put that on, I'm going to go ahead and blast that with a drop of reel oil. Then I'm going to go ahead and place that handle side plate onto the reel and hold it together by hand. and that should fit nicely on there. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to replace the screws that hold that on. Okay, so now we have the handle side plate assembled. We reinserted the screws on the outside and we reinserted the screws on the inside, and so that should be snug on there. And now that we have that done, we can go for the sleeve. And now remember, the sleeve has one end that is perfectly circular and the other end that has two straight sides in that oblong rectangular shape, and the rectangular shape goes out or to the top and the round shape opening goes down. And you're going to simply slide that over the main gear shaft and tuck that down in there. Then we're going to replace the click washer, which has a click spring inside it, and we're going to replace those two curved washers in the same orientation that we removed them in, because we were careful not to put them upside down when we picked them up and cleaned them, so we know they're in the same position going back in. The washer. And now that we have that in place, we're ready to attach the star drag. Now the star drag is simply a matter of screwing it on. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get that first thread in because of the shape of the interior of the star drag. So when you go to spin that on, if there's any resistance whatsoever, stop what you're doing, because if you cross thread that, you're going to damage the inside of the star drag. So it should go on as simply as that, as smoothly as that, I should say. And if it doesn't, take it off and start over again. So I'm just going to wind that down, and once it gets to the click spring in there, you have to hold the worm gear and the level wind guide in place, otherwise they want to move, and then you can crank it down a little bit. So now that we have the star drag replaced, we can go for the handle washer, then the handle, and the handle nut. And again, just like on the star drag, you want to make sure you get that first thread in correctly, and it should go on nice and smoothly. If there's any resistance, pull it back off and start over again, because there shouldn't be any resistance there. It should go on very smoothly. I'm going to get my 10mm wrench and I'm going to tighten this down, but not a lot. I'm just going to make it snug. You do not want to over tighten your handle nut. So now we're going to take our handle nut retainer, and that has the hole for the screw that lines up with the hole in the handle. And so you'll line that up as best you can, and then you can move it a little bit to line it up all the way if it's slightly off, because if it's slightly off, that screw will not go in. So once I have that all set, I can put the screw in. And like I said, that should go in easy like that. If it does not go in easy, it's because the retainer isn't lined up properly with the hole, and you just have to tweak it a little bit one way or the other. So now we're good to go on the handle side, and we can finish up by reinserting the spool. I'm going to hit that bearing with some oil. Put a drop of oil in on the bottom of the pinion gear and on the worm gear. We're going to drop the spool in place. And our last component will be the palm side plate, which also has a bearing. And that bearing is for the magnetic brake dial. And so we're going to hit that with a drop of oil. And click that in place. And that, my friends, is it. We are finished. One clean, quiet, smooth reel. We'll make sure the thumb release works. Make sure the handle works. Nice and smooth. Well, I hope this video was a help to you if you own a Soleus reel from Favorite Fishing. Very good reel. I love this reel. Take good care of it. It'll last you a long time. You catch a lot of fish on it. I hope you liked the video. If you did, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. As always, thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing. We will see you next time. And until then, stay fishing, my friends.